Okay, dear colleagues and experts, let's start our second half. So the first speaker is from China National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment, Mr. Liang Jiang, and the topic is study on the multi-mycotoxin co-occurrence characteristics of cereal foods and the cumulative risk assessment of Chinese population. Since she's worried about the network connection, so there is a video pre-recorded. Now please play the video. And the speaker is also online. So if you have any question, you can raise the question and discuss with the speaker afterwards.
各位线上线下的专家，大家好。
Dear experts online and offline, good morning. I'm from the National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment, Liang Jiang. It is my great opportunity. It is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about the study on the multi-mycotoxin co-occurrence characteristics of cereal foods and the cumulative risk assessment of Chinese population. We know that mycotoxins are low molecular weight secondary metabolites produced by fungi, and according to FAO, estimates about 25% of the world's grains are polluted by mycotoxins, which can cause nearly 1 billion tons of grain losses every year. And the intake of mycotoxins may result in some acute and chronic health impacts, including hepatic toxicity, endocrine interference, etc. Cereal products can have co-occurrence of multi-mycotoxins, and we are exposed to the multi-mycotoxins via the various diets. So the health risk of multi-mycotoxin co-occurrence should draw more attention. So weather and other climatic conditions may affect the scope and intensity of mycotoxin pollution. So according to IOMIN data, it has provided data from samples submitted from different regions of the world. So because of the geological and climatic difference, there's also difference in the mycotoxin contamination in cereal foods across different regions. So you can see in China and Southeast Asia, multi-mycotoxin exposure is relatively high. And according to the data, over 64% of the cereal food products samples, at least one type of mycotoxin can be detected. And our team has studied the characteristic of mycotoxin and also the population exposure difference across different regions in China. So from the graph, you can see that due to different environmental factors such as geography and climate, aflatoxin has a regional difference, and the dietary exposure is also subject to the dietary structure in different places. But as for multi-mycotoxins, now there is still a lack of study on its characteristic analysis in cereal foods, as well as systematic study of cumulative risk assessment of the Chinese population. Based on the existing study, we use systematic literature review and the national risk monitoring and human biomonitoring data to extract the biomarker monitoring data, etc. And we use meta-analysis, big data, and correlation analysis to carry out the classified study on the multi-mycotoxin co-occurrence characteristics of cereal products. And as for recent literature in the recent 10 years, we have done a systematic search, and this graph shows the process for literature review. And as for wheat and wheat flour, we have searched both the Chinese and the English keywords in the literature library. And after decoupling, there are altogether 153 literatures. And after evaluating the quality of the literatures, 69 literatures were selected for meta-analysis, including over 20,000 samples. So these 69 literatures in both English and Chinese was published from 2001 to 2011, including 57 raw wheat grains and 12 wheat flour with a sample size of over 20,000. And there were 21 literatures from China. And in terms of the date of publication, you can see that from 2002, the number of literatures has been increasing, reaching the peak in 2016. As for mycotoxin-related study in wheat, DOA actually has the most literature. And then is AIV, ZEN, and then NIV. And based on the literature, we have used our software for meta-analysis. And after the data analysis, we have used a random effect model, and based on MetaProp and MetaMead, we have analyzed the contamination rate and the level of contamination in wheat and wheat flour. So according to meta-analysis, the total contamination occurrence is 58%, and the total contamination level is 32.8 microgram per kilogram. So you can see TA, TN, TA, and GON have relatively higher occurrence, which is around 85 to 99%. And in terms of the contamination level, the highest one is still DON, and then TA and FB. And in terms of the meta-analysis, you can see that in different countries and regions, there are different contamination levels compared with the overall level. China's occurrence rate and level are relatively high in China. And according to the literatures published in China, we found that in wheat and wheat flour, the main toxins are still DON, and then it is TEN and TEA. So in terms of occurrence rate and occurrence level, these are still relatively high. And in the literature, 20 literatures shown there is a combined co-occurrence of DON and ZEN. So there are relatively higher occurrence of DON and ZEN in China, which can be as high as 26.7%. And then there is a co-occurrence combined with other toxins, including TE and TEN. So we can identify the mycotoxin co-occurrence for this study, but due to the limited number of literature, maybe the result is a little deviated. And then, based on the national surveillance data, we have conducted for the study. And in this study, based on food surveillance study in typical areas of China, considering the dietary structure, climate, and environment characteristics in China, we have selected Conagra and Sichuan as typical areas for study. From 2016 to 2019, we extracted the cereal product multi-mycotoxin test data from the national surveillance data, including wheat, rice, and corn. We extracted the samples from the market, wet markets, supermarkets, etc. And we tested DON, ZEN, and IV altogether 6 types of toxins. And after acquiring the data, we use big data correlation algorithm to characterize the occurrence and co-occurrence of those toxins, and then obtain the high co-occurrence combination for the study or exposure study. We also need another kind of data, which is the consumption data of the three cereals from the three regions, which is also from the National Dietary Survey. So the multi-mycotoxin exposure evaluation is for those priority co-occurrence mycotoxins. And we have evaluated the single mycotoxin and multi-mycotoxin for the cumulative risk assessment and the single risk assessment, respectively. As for single mycotoxin, its exposure and the health guidance value are computed with the reference values to gain the HQ value. And as for cumulative risk assessment, we use we add all the doses, which is add the HQ of single mycotoxins to get the cumulative risk indicator HI. So when HQ and HI are lower than 1, then that risk is deemed acceptable. Otherwise, we need to pay more attention to such risks. So this slide shows the cereal consumption characteristic in the three regions. And the left graph shows the average consumption, and this comparison with P95 of wheat, rice, and maize in the three regions. So you can see Henan, which is represented in the orange bar. So its average level and P95 level are obviously higher than that in Anhui and Sichuan. As for rice, and the situation is different. So the blue bar represents Anhui province. So you can see that Anhui has the highest rice consumption, and then followed by Henan and Sichuan. And as for maize, the difference is quite obvious. The orange bar, which represents Henan, actually is far higher than the maize consumption in the other region, in the other provinces. The table on the right side shows the consumption ratio, which means the percentage of a population who consume that type of cereal products among the total population. So as for wheat, you can see that in Anhui, the wheat consumption ratio is lower than that of Henan and Sichuan, while Henan's consumption ratio of wheat is as high as over 90%. And as for rice, Anhui has the highest consumption ratio, and then followed by Sichuan, which are all over 99%. And as for maize, the difference is also quite obvious. In Henan, the consumption ratio is 26.57, which is far higher than the other two provinces. So this shows the consumption characteristic of the populations in different areas of the cereal products. And next, we use the food surveillance data from 2016 to 2019 to study the mycotoxin. So first, let's look at wheat. The highest detection rate goes to DON, which is as high as 73.9%, followed by NIV, 14.3%. And as for FBS and the ZEM, they are around 10% detection rate. And in terms of occurrence level, DON occurrence level is far higher than other types of mycotoxins. It is a main mycotoxin in wheat. And as for rice and the rice products, you can see that the occurrence level is relatively low in rice. In terms of detection occurrence rate, DON is the highest with at 34.6%. which is far lower than the DON occurrence rate. In wheat and in rice, aflatoxin, ZN, and FP can also be detected, but the occurrence rate and the occurrence level in rice is relatively low. And as for maize and maize products, the main mycotoxins are FB, which has an occurrence rate of 56.2%, followed by DON 54.7%. So in terms of occurrence rate and occurrence level, these two mycotoxins are relatively high. And the third one is the EN among maize products, 33.3% occurrence rate, and aflatoxin and OTA. And the occurrence level of the remaining two mycotoxins is higher than that of wheat and rice. And from the graph, you can see that blue, which represents Anhui, in terms of DON, Anhui's DON is higher than other provinces in wheat. And as for rice, the difference in different regions on DON is smaller, and also the same case for maize. As for another mycotoxin in maize, FBS, you can see that Henan's FBS occurrence rate is higher than that in Anhui and Sichuan, and then combined with the consumption data in different areas, we have studied the exposure characteristics of multi-mycotoxin from different cereal foods.
So from this graph, we can clearly see that the DON is the most exposed type of the three mycotoxins. And so at the level of the exposure, wheat is a major source of exposure. And the overall profile of exposure to the various mycotoxins in the three cereals is similar across regions. However, there are some regional differences. For example, the Henan, in the wheat source of the DON, the exposure level is slightly higher than that in the other two regions and to Henan. And the maize exposure level is higher than the other two regions. And in addition, on the basis of a cereal polypeptide monitoring data, we further use the association rule algorithm and calculations to carry out the analysis of the pollution characteristics. And in the previous study, we used association rules in data mining based on a parameter and to construct a correlation analysis calculation system for multi-component mycotoxins in domestic food represented by wheat. And the picture on the left is showing the procedures of our algorithm. And so we needed to do some discretization and the risk classification of the monitoring data for the extra teratoxin, and then we establish a database, and so we can have the indicators such as the reliability, and we can use such correlation analysis. And let's look at the results. And from this graph, and we can see the DON among the three major cereals, and it is the major contaminate mycotoxin. And so we can see the high degree of association is mainly DON or some other combined mycotoxins, binary combinations of, together with DON, and for example, the NFB. And so the three kinds of cereals, the combination of mycotoxins that are common to all three types of cereals is hypothermia and CON, which are quite common in the three cereals. And we also know there are some relatively high triadic combinations, DON, NIV, and FB are combined. So this is the case as a whole for contamination characteristics. Based on the results of the previous association analysis on the binary combination of DON and the ZN in each regional population, and we started the cumulative exposure risk assessment. And then we made a judgment based on HQ and HI values. When HQ and HI are less than temporary, we consider risk to be low. But from the single exposure is that the average exposure risk in the three regions can be accepted. However, and to those in people in Anhui, and so the DON is exposure level is relatively higher. However, so under the binary combination of DO and AO, the average accumulative exposure risk is acceptable in Henan and Sichuan. However, to keep the population in Anhui, no matter in terms of the average consumption level or the high consumption level, and the exposure risk is relatively higher, which needs further attention. And based on the monitored data, to further accurately get the characteristics of the exposure, and with started the research, and we randomly sampled more than 300 people, and we also 311 people were randomly selected, and about 100 people in each province, and we were able to control the age and the gender in this study, and we carry out the DON and the ZN and other 8 mycotoxins, metabolites, and we determine the priority mix for the cumulative exposure assessment. And then after it is done, we also look at the mycotoxin in the drug, as well as the biologically labeled level of metabolites combined with a rate of excretion of mycotoxins in the urine. And we also adopted the HI and the HQ indicators, and we had evaluated the risk of a cumulative exposure to a single mycotoxin and multiple mycotoxins separately. Let's look specifically at the detection of the metabolite biomarkers in the urine samples in the regions, and we can see that the DON and followed by ZN, as well as the NIV and the DNS were detected over 10%. But we can see another mycotoxin was detected over 0.96%. This has to do with the metabolic pathway of this mycotoxin. In terms of the content level, the DON is undoubtedly the highest in the whole population. The average level in the dose was 90.8 nanograms, followed by an IV. And let's look at the differences across regions. The blue colored represents the Anhui region, and the multiple mycotoxins detection rate is higher than the other 2 regions, and we can see that the DON content is higher than the other 2 areas. Now let's look at that the co-occurrence of multiple metabolic biomarkers in different populations. From the chart on the left, we can see that the 64.3 out of urine samples in the total population contained at least one mycotoxin. And we can see that the detection rate of a mycotoxin is between 55 and 80%. And we can see in the population of multiple mycotoxin biomarkers, 46.3% of urine samples were discovered, what is detected. And the detection rate in Henan province reached 74.6%. And so this result is consistent with our previous analysis of polytoxic pollution characteristics in cereals by monitoring data. And we also see the proportion of co-occurrence of DNA and IV is relatively higher, and the percentage reached up to 19% and even 28.7% in Anhui province. And then the DNA and NIV, a binary combination, we conducted a cumulative risk assessment of internal exposure from the in vivo exposure level to a single mytoxin, and the DON exposure level reached 30 micrograms per kilogram of body weight per day. It is significantly higher than the levels of NIV 0.79 and the 0.02. And for the DON mycotoxins, and we can see that the average exposure level in Anhui reached 5.85 micrograms per kilogram of body weight per day, higher than the 2.82 in Henan and 0.48 in Sichuan. So from a single mycotoxin risk, and we can see the risk in Sichuan, Henan, and Anhui are all high, and the average HQ value is 3.02. But in Anhui, it reached 5.85. And a binary combination of DON and ZN in the case of community exposure reached the HI value went up to 3.1, and under triplet combination, it went up to 3.7. So we can see that the cumulative exposure level in the three provinces need a further addition. And generally speaking, through the systematic literatures we searched earlier together with our risk monitoring, and we can see that in the cereals, and there is a relatively high rate of contamination by mycotoxins. However, and through the monitoring data and the population internal exposure data, and we can see that the mycotoxins like DON, NZN, NIV, such a number of binary and ternary combination is a relatively strong correlation, or there is a probability of a high pollution, and which can provide a basis for us to further carry out a community for exposure assessment of the mycotoxin. And we know that the exposure level varied from regions, but generally speaking, DON is still the main exposure of the mycotoxin in different areas of China. And so we need to pay attention to the exposure levels and the risk for people who consume high amounts of food in China. And currently, the result of our current cumulative exposure risk assessment for the Chinese population is still affected by the lack of data on the representative mycotoxins, and there are certain limitations and uncertainties. In addition, the selection of the cumulative exposure combination is mainly based on the association and the probability of co-contamination and co-exposure. And for the next step, and there is still a lack of consideration in the joint effects of different independent mycotoxins. And so that's a step, and we need more mycotoxin combined actation model. And we will also explore the MIVE PPTK new evaluation methods, and we are on our way for further exploration, and we look forward to working with the experts. Thank you for your attention to my presentation. Welcome your valuable comments and suggestions.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Liang, for your report. Any question? In the interest of time, we only have the time for one question. Okay, there is a question here. Now, you also pay attention to Ziyan, right? In your presentation. Okay, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Which has allowed us to have a full picture of the mycotoxin exposure in China. And you have talked about fusarium. Actually, aflatoxin is a first class carcinogen. So actually, it should draw more attention, right? Aflatoxin among our serial data actually is also included. But our study is mainly about the correlation of co-occurrence. Aflatoxin in cereal products actually its occurrence rate and the occurrence level in the three types of cereal, wheat cereal, wheat, rice, and maize. So maybe in maize, aflatoxin has relatively high occurrence rate and occurrence level, but actually in wheat and rice, the occurrence of aflatoxin is still relatively low because aflatoxin actually mainly appears in, for example, peanut oil and peanut related products. So in terms of our data, the main toxins are DON and fusarium, so which have relatively high occurrence level. And we have also conducted a systematic aflatoxin exposure assessment, and according to that assessment, we found that although in wheat and rice, the occurrence level of aflatoxin is not as high as that in maize and peanut, the consumption ratio is relatively high. So as a result, the exposure, total exposure still needs to draw more attention, as it's also a main source of exposure. Okay, thank you, Ms. Liang, again, for your presentation. And the second speaker for the second half is our on-site moderator, Mr. Zhou Ying from Fudan University. And his topic is about bisphenols exposure. Okay, the floor is yours. So first of all, thank you, Mr. Li, for your invitation. So actually, this is also a subject study under the leadership of Mr. Li. Okay, now I will start my presentation. You know that bisphenol BP, as well as its derivatives, have two phenol rings. And these substances are mainly used, or more and more used, in food packagings. For example, plastic bottles, drinking bottles, or cans. And through ingestion, human is exposed to BPA. BPS, BPF, BPS, and BPAF through thermal paper and personal care products can also being exposed through skin contact. BPA is a very typical endocrine disrupting chemical. EPA and other authorities have already provided this reference level and also the TDI level. Because BPA is restricted in many aspects, so usually BPA, BPF, and BPS are mainly used. Now, in vivo and in vitro study in this regard on the BPA substitutes, for example, BPF, BPS, and BPAF, have similar endocrine disrupting effect, mainly combining with estrogen receptor. And that effect is similar or even stronger than that of BPA. And with a widely application of such substances, the exposure frequency and also the exposure level have drawn a lot of attention. However, so far, there is no health guidance value to evaluate these substitutes. So we are thinking maybe we can research from this perspective to address that issue. So first of all, we need to establish a PBPK model. Ara, etc., have already developed a PBPK model for bisphenol through ingestion and skin exposure. But in this model, the skin compartment is assumed to be a single homogeneous, well-stirred compartment, which accordingly ignores the discrepancy in the real resistances of different human skin layers to absorption of BP. Second, the skin absorption parameters for 3 BPA substitutes, for example, absorption fractions and bioaccessibility, were cited from those for BPA. So the skin root PBPK model for the 3 substitutes still has a gap here. So that's why we are doing research in this regard to address that knowledge gap in the characterization of dermal PK of the 3 high concerned BPA substitutes. So we come up with this skin compartment model as shown in the graph here. There are 3 parts or 3 subcompartments. The first is a follicle. Second is stratum cornum. And next is epidermis. Through skin exposure, when the skin is exposed to such compounds, first of all, on the surface of the skin, those compounds will form an SSD layer, which is called skin surface depot. So those compounds first stay in the depot, and then it can enter the subcompartments of a follicle or the stratum corneum. If it enters the follicle, then it can directly enter the systemic circulation. If it goes into stratum corneum, then part of it will be transferred to epidermis and then go to systemic circulation. And then part of it will be removed from the body through dander. And on the right side, you can see the formulas for the calculation of concentration in different compartments. This differential equation. And we put it in the model developed by Carroll, etc. And based on their model, we further break down the skin compartments into exposed and unexposed skin compartments, so as to form a new PK model. For the 4 substances, and evaluate its oral and skin exposures of the 4 substances. And next is parametrization for the model. As for bioaccessibility, dermal bioaccessibility, we carried out a volunteer study in order to obtain the fraction of BPS in TP transferred to skin. And then the absorbed fractions of BP applied to the exposed skin via TP or PCP. So these are 2 very important parameters. And there are also some chemical specific parameters, of which we use CUSA, which is a normal method. And then there are some physiological parameters which we just directly cite from literatures. So this is a process for parametrization. Next, we'd like to introduce how we carry out the test. Now there is no standard for the dermal bioaccessibility parameter analysis, and there are not so many literatures in this regard. So after reviewing a lot of literature, we have designed this protocol. First, we recruited volunteers, 4 volunteers in total, 2 males and 2 females. We used BPS to prepare a simulated sample, and then apply that on the volunteers' skin, like that in real case. And after applying it or exposure of 10 minutes, that's also based on that exposure time is also following what is reported in the literature. So usually the exposure time is around 10 minutes. And after that 10-minute exposure, we have carried out a series of exposure cycles. Altogether, there are 4 cycles. And at every timing point, we use parametrization to obtain the residue level on the skin. Using the two equations, we can calculate the two fractions I mentioned before. And this study has also been approved by the Ethics Committee. This is for BPS exposure. And as for BPF and the BPAF, many use PCP exposure, PCPS exposure. First, we prepare a simulated PCPS sample. Which use the isotope labeling substance for preparation. And after preparing the simulated PCPS, we recruited 5 volunteers, 2 males and 3 females for the dermal application test, as shown in the pictures here. And then we obtain the exposure residue on the skin, BPF and BPAF. So we obtain the residue at 8 time points. And as for the absorption fraction, it is calculated from this equation. And BPF has the same process, just a difference in the exposure timing. And so different substances have a different exposure time.
Okay, now let's look at the results. So this is the dermal bioaccessibility of a BPS exposure from the TP. And we found that so the average bioaccessibility is about 26.96%. But for BPF and BPAF exposure, and for example, the skincare and cosmetics, and firstly, we calculated the F sub, and for BPF, it was 31.65%, and for BPAF, it was 12.94% in average, and we suppose that the F sub is equals to the bioaccessibility. And with such key parameters, we leverage the current data of the toxikinetics, and we correct and validate the model is mainly via ingestion and dermal absorption routes as the exposure pathway. And let's look at this chart. And we can see this is the oral PK model for BPS. And what is on the left, there's a comparison between the previous model and our model. And we can see that in the model and the measured data cannot match the real data, but our study and our model, and we can see the simulated concentration and the measured concentration are within the same range. But for dermal PK model, and what is shown above is the previous dermal BPK model for BPS, and we can see the simulated ring cumulative excretion amount of total BPS. The simulation was not very good, but after in our study, and leverage our corrected model for BPS, and we can see the observed value is quite matching with the measured value. And we also had a validation study of dermal BPPK modeling of BPA. And we can see that firstly, the highest concentration in the serum, and you'll see no matter in terms of the total BPA or conjugated BPA, and we can see the variation is within the 100%. And for the total BPS and the expected predicted value is controlled within 1.5 times. And WHO for BPA modeling has once issued a result, and if the prediction that are within 2 times of the observed data is considered adequate. We meet such requirement. And for BPS and the validation of the dermal BPPK modeling, and we can see the serum concentration of unconjugated BPS and the curves as shown in the slide, and our predicted values are within the acceptable range. But in this study, we didn't conduct the validation of PPPK models for BPF and the BPAF because firstly, we didn't find the PK data of human exposure to BPF and BPAF via ingestion and dermal contact. And currently, we didn't perform the human administration studies to obtain the PK data. We directly used some available data, and so we didn't go through validation process. And in terms of the uncertainty analysis of dermal PPPK models, and for the dermal exposure model, we can see that the uncertainty coefficient is from 1.3 to 1.8, which demonstrates that our model and is in the moderate uncertainty, which is acceptable. And through such a study, and we got the BPA, BPAF, BPF, and BPS via ingestion and dermal absorption PPPK models. We assumed that female adults were daily exposed, aged from 20 to 50, were daily exposed to equal dose of BPS, and we chose a BPA temporary values, and through the dermal and skincare product exposure. And we find it really interesting that for BPA and BPF, so via the skincare product exposure, the predicted concentration is higher than the ingestion exposure. And for BPS and BPA, the food exposure level is higher than the dermal and skincare product exposure. Then the prediction is about the in vivo exposure in the reproductive organs of the female adults, in the gonads of the female adults. Then which is correlated to the further study. And we had another study we use the data from Toxicast in vitro high throughput screening assays associated with the estrogen receptor activation pathway so as to establish the dose-response relationships. And then obtain the AC5 values, causing 5% maximum ER activity for BPA, BPS, BPF, and BPAF respectively. And it is regarded as a cutoff value. It leads to a series, a set of values, and we use the lowest AC5 as a POD for individual BPs. And look, if we look at the table on the right, we can see all 4 compounds have a POD value. And as mentioned by other speakers, in vitro to in vivo extrapolation, we also leverage this technology. Then the AC5 is transferred into a human equivalent doses, which known as the HEDS. And after we got such as HED value, and based on the formula on the right bottom corner, and we can come up with the we can set the BPA as index compound to calculate the relative potency factor of BPS, BPF, and BPAF. And then we can obtain the group BPA equivalent dose. And after we got such values, all the BPA, BPS, BPF, and the BPAF exposure can be transferred to BPA equivalents. Then we can conduct risk assessment. And we searched some literature, we got the different exposure sources, the BPA, BPF, BPS, BPAF, the exposure, the in vitro exposure level. And we first calculated the exposure levels of individual BPs from different sources in female adults. And then we developed PBPK models for BPs, which were applied to convert the exposure level of individual BPs from skin route to oral route. And then we obtained the aggregate exposure levels of individual BPs. And finally, we calculate the group BPA equivalent exposure amount, which was around 46.61. And based on the HBPV value, and we can calculate that the MOE equals to 600. Then we completed the 2 exposure sources with 4 target substances risk assessment. Okay, let me come to my conclusion. We developed the oral and dermal PBPK models for 4 individual BPs, BPA, BPS, BPF, and BPAF. And we established a group of BPA equivalents. And the estimated MOE in this study suggested that female adults in China have low health risk of exposure to BPA, BPS, BPF, and BPAF via ingestion and dermal routes. And acknowledgement goes to the Wu Yongning, Li Jingguang professor from SAC, and Professor Zhang Wei from Zhejiang University, as well as He Gengsheng of Xu Weiding from Fudan University, and this is my email address. And welcome for further communication and exchange. Okay, that's all from me today. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Mr. Zhou. Any question from the audience online or offline? And Mr. Zhou, and please be the moderator on site. Hello, Professor Zhou. Thank you for your nice presentation. And currently, you only have BPA, right? Yes, the BPA. We will only have BPA limitation, which is around 4 micrograms. But EFSA recently further lowered the BA to a nanogram level, and we are discussing about it. And currently, there is a BPA limits in food, but what about the cosmetic products? No, not yet. So there is only a limit of a BPA in food. Yes, it's very meaningful. Any more question? Okay. Now let's move on to the next presentation. And the next presentation will be Dr. Yingheng Tao, representing Professor He Gengsheng, to introduce their study in dioxin. Thank you.
Good morning. Today, my topic is a derivation of a health-based guidance value for dioxin based on Chinese using benchmark dose method and a physiologically based PK model. So it is a cooperated project from 3 organizations. So this is my content background, dose response relationship and benchmark dose PPPK model optimization, force PT WI derivation, and the last part is methodological comparison. So dioxin and other related substances can be called DLCs, which includes PCDD, PCDF, and the DLPCB. And then the main sources come from waste incineration, fuel combustion, chemical industry, and the exposure route is mainly through dietary intake, which accounts for over 90%. And the half-life of dioxin is dose-dependent, which is about 7 to 11 years. From the picture on the right side, you can see that dioxin has a wide effect on health. On the left side, you can see it has a disturbance or interference of the reproductive and immune system, and also it has an impact on nervous, endocrine system, reproductive toxicity, and developmental toxicity. So considering the wide impact on health of dioxin, so EPA and the EFSA in 2010 and 2018 respectively have come up with the health guidance values. So this is a basic process for EPA and IFSA to come up with a health guidance value. So they all use human and studies as a main evidence and animal studies as auxiliary evidence. They have used, for example, the dioxin in serum. So as for POD selection, EPA used the sperm motility, total sperm motility, and the sperm concentration to come up with a L'Oreal value, which is 39 pg per gram fat and 68 pg per gram fat, respectively. And IFSA uses the Russian children cohort SPERC concentration to come up with a Noel value. It is 7.0 pg. And as for the uncertainty factor, EPA uses 10 and use 3 to characterize the individual difference, while IFSA after a series of consideration, has adopted UF at 1. So by gaining the UF adjusted internal exposure, PBPK model is used for TCDD. So EPA uses Almond model, while IFSA uses Rees model. And the TWI value is 4.7 and 2.0 pg per gram of fat, respectively. So this table summarizes the dioxin equivalent study of 3 institutions, including SCF. SCF uses animal study, but EPA and EFSA uses humans study. In terms of the substance, IFSA uses PCDDFS, but EPA and SCF have used TCDD. As for outcomes, 3 of them considered sperm quality very important outcome. There are other outcomes, including birth outcomes, endometriosis, and thyroid hormones. In terms of the model, EPA and EFSA uses PK model, and in terms of UF, SF uses 3.2 to express the TCDD half-lives, and 3 for L'Oreal to Novel. And since it uses animal model, so here it uses UF of 1. And as for EPA, it uses L'Oreal to L'Oreal extrapolation and has used 3 as a UF. IFSA considered that its sample size is 133 and it is repeated measures, so it does not apply UF. And it has also evaluated PBPK model and believes that PBPK model can already characterize the internal and external exposure, so it doesn't use UF. So this is a basic thinking for the test, including male datasets and female datasets, as well as datasets from Chinese literature. And the graph at the bottom are the models for this study, including dose response relationship and benchmark dose, and optimization and application of PBPK models so as to get dioxin HBGV for Chinese people. So the first data set is a pregnant women data set. It is from Beijing. It is a prospective nested case control study. The mirrored biomarkers, including serum DLCs, fasting blood glucose, and 1 hour postprandial glucose, and also gestational diabetes mellitus blood lipid. So this data set was from China National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment, and the graph on the right side shows the Lasso regression method, which shows that the DLC contributed the most to the occurrence of GDM. And the second data set is the main data set from Hubei, China. It is a cross-sectional study, and it measures serum DLCS and sperm abnormality rate, sperm concentration, etc. And this data is from Hubei Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And the third data set is also for pregnant women. It's also from Hubei. It's a birth outcome, birth cohort. It estimates ALT, AST, and the GGT data. This data set is also from Hubei Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This is an overview of the study method. As for the raw data, we have processed in 2 ways. First, based on the DLC 10 fraction, we gain the average and SD value of DLCs. And the second way is to directly analyze the raw data. As for the first method, we used 3 softwares. But as for individual data, we use VBAX software, which is relatively more flexible. Those softwares have their advantages. For example, BMS and ProX and the Baines BMD can consolidate the pre-existing data, and based on the different types of outcomes, we have discrete variables and other variables. And IFSA and EPA still have some disagreements on the data, and IFSA believes that there is fewer impact of errors in discrete variables. the two institutions recommend to use extra risk. And on the right side is standards we set for those models. So if the p-value is close to 0, then these set of variables are not fit for BMD method. But as for a single model, if it is outside, the dose is outside the range, or the model tends to be linear, or if the BMD and BMDL is over 3, then it is not fit for the statistic model, but may not necessarily, but may be fit for BMD method. So this is an analysis for pregnancy in women, and we use a conditional logistics regression model. So you can see at Q3, so at Q4, it has reached a very significant level. So Q3 can be deemed as a novel value for pregnancy diabetes, and the diagnostic standards is listed below. After gaining the relationship between DLCs and the GDM through the BMDS software, you can see that we use the 10% extra risk, and we have obtained the probate model. The BMDL is 3.8 pg per gram of fat. If we use Bayes method, then the result is 2.03 pg. This is the same set of data running on ProAst software, and 10% BMI response range to adjust the TG and BMI, and the booster trap result is 1.86 pg. And this is the result from BBMD software. We have used, say, the MCMC iterations and 25% warm-up. So probate model result is similar with the previous results. So now here the BMDL10 is 3.14 pg. And the BMDL10 of the model average is 1.98 pg. So diabetes 1 may be the result of co-occurrence of multiple contaminants. So in order to evaluate which is the biggest contributor to pregnancy diabetes, we have used this machine regression model. And on the left side, you can see we explored the relationship between DLCs and the GDM. And you can see the PIP value is over 0.5. So when we analyze DLCs, POD value, we need to consider the role of 153. So we have developed a model on Winbucks, and we used the MCMC iterations is 30,000, and the MCMC chains is 3. So the BMDL 10 is 4.3 pg, assuming BDE 153 exposure level is median. So you can see after adjusting BDE 153, the dioxin POD value has increased a little bit. And this is the result applying the male dataset, and there is a Q3 applied. So you can see the sperm morphology, sperm neck abnormality, and sperm head abnormality. With the rising Q3, all these three parameters have also increased. And this is the BMDS software result to analyze the relationship between DLCs and the sperm quality. So you can see the left graph shows the relationship between DLCs and sperm neck abnormality, and the right side shows the relationship between DLCs and sperm tail abnormality. So the BMDL is already over 3. And we have also used the ProAst and BBMD softwares for DLC and to analyze the relationship between DLC and the sperm quality, but the result is not very good in these two models and do not meet the set standards. And there is a slide to summarize why they do not meet our set standards. This graph shows the relationship between DLCs and transaminase, and there are Q5, 5 quartiles included. So you can see the dose-related dose response. And this is using BMDS software to analyze the relationship between DLCs and the transaminase. So you can see that DLC and ASPLT's best model is KO model, and the BMDL is 12.65%. Using BMDS3 model, the BMDL10 is 13.08 PG. But this cannot be, the model did not fit very well in ProEst and BBMD because of the difference in methodology. So this graph shows why it does not fit our standards. For example, overfitted outside the dose range, or the model tended to be linear and the parameters estimations failed. And the third reason is BMD and BMDL tended to 0. And fourth, you can see that the p-value for all model tests is below 0.1. And the fifth is BMD, as I mentioned, BMD and BMDL over 3. So if these fail to meet our set standards, then we deem this fitting a failure. So this is the DLC dose response relationship, and the inclusion criteria refers to EPA, including potential health effects and the dose relationship, and the selection criteria was according to IFSA, including sufficient population and animal evidence, low novel, etc. And from here, you can see the main outcome include 3-beta HSD and DHEA. With the PCDD FTQ value is 8.57, and dioxin also has impact on lipid metabolism, and some impact on weight, height, and BMI at 6 months and 3 years old, as well as diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So we have come up with 8.57, the value at 8.57.
And I got the potential POD values, and we established the PBPK model, and we made a comparison between two PBPK models. And it didn't take the milk breeding, the breastfeeding into consideration. And both models are developed for TCDD. The main compartments of both models are liver and adipose tissue, and the association between serum level and dietary exposure level has been verified. And we see that the RIS model has the advantages, which is more useful when bird feeding is considered at assumed daily exposures, and almond model has allows the estimation of the concentration of dioxins bound to AHR, and we use the RIS model, and we can see the body weight estimation here. And because the two models were both developed for TCDD, and the metabolic rates of dioxins and the DSCs were dramatically different, and the model previous model was developed for European Americans, and it needs to be optimized for Chinese. Through integrating the current available data sets, and we optimize the data, and the optimization data refers to the population-based data of 5 regions in China, plus 16 individuals. The validation data came from the data of 3 regions in Hubei, China. And this is a flow chart of a PBPK model, and we selected 6 most important parameters, and we can see the 3 MCMC chains and 20,000 iterations, and whether we adopted RMSE, And we can see that what is shown on the bottom left, it is the convergence test. And the prior and posterior distribution of parameters are different. And this model also adopts the WHO criteria for verification, whether it is suitable for Chinese population. And we can see that the difference between the estimations of a PPPK model and actual measurement was not more than 2 times, indicating the applicability of the model in Chinese population and RMSE of the training population-based data set, individual data set, and validating population-based data set decreased. And it further demonstrates that this model is applicable to China's population. And we can see that the uncertainty of kinetics was estimated by 95 quantiles medium, ranging from 1.25 to 1.3. And after getting the potential POD values, and we should leverage the uncertainty factors and modifying factors, and we temporarily set the UF as 1, and because we want to check, we have the cohort study, and we didn't adjust the UF coefficient for time. And the deficiencies in database quality was 0.5 because the bioaccessibility of a PCDD in food groups such as rice, vegetable, and meat was lower than 50%, which was different from the bioaccessibility in corn oil, eggs, breast milk, and other carriers obtained by EFSA. And this is the PDDI and PDWI calculated at different PODs, and we know that the diabetes during pregnancy is a sensitive indicator, and it is in the range of from 2.24 to 2.68. And we can see after the adjustment, the result is the 5.46. And we know that the dioxin, the dioxin on male sperm quality is a very classic outcome, and we can see the adjusted PTWI was 9.24. And next slide is about methodological comparison. And for EPA, the real value was used, which was identified using a clinical cutoff value. And however, the BMD modeling is not appropriate due to the lack of lower those groups, but EFSA, the NOEL was identified using comparisons between those quartiles. However, the BMD modeling is not appropriate due to the lack of individual data and a clear dose response relationship. But in our study, after grouping by the dose quantile, it was found that the GDM, AST, and other outcomes had clear dose response relationships, and individual data were available. So the BMD modeling was appropriate. And let's look at the POD. It is more difficult to achieve significant differences between groups in studies with small sample size. And in terms of the substances we studied, and compared with SCF and EFSA, and so the PCBS had only a weak or insignificant association. But in terms of PPPK model, And our study optimized the race model in terms of outcomes. And we can see our study the added glucose metabolism and sperm quality, as well as transminas as the indicators. And we compared with the IFSA study, and we had certain advantages. And because this is a new sensitive outcome for dioxin, and nested case control study and birth cohort study with large sample size. And we also made full use of individual data. And the PCDD FS had clear dose response relationships with multiple outcomes. At the same time, the PPPK model is optimized for Chinese. And we also take the bioaccessibility of PCDD into consideration. Acknowledgement should go to the National Science and Technological Department, and many thanks go to the disease control centers in Hubei and Zhejiang. And thank you for your nice representation. Any question from online and on-site audience? There is a question from on-site audience. I'm from Shanghai Testing Institute, and we also pay a lot of attention to the detection of dioxin. So I'm quite interested in your study. And previously, and when we made a simulation, and I like to ask, so the samples, how the samples impact impact out of on the result, on the study result. And thank you for your question. So the out of 10 and out of 5 selection is based on the number of samples. And actually, the individual data is a better choice for 10th unit. But for many statistical models, and cannot accurately estimate some results, but we think the NIC in the quantile cannot be taken for reference. Quintile. Any other questions? I have a question. When you chose 0.5 for bioaccessibility, and what was your consideration? Actually, the bioaccessibility was from 0.1 to 0.9, and mostly 0.3, but we chose 0.5 as a relatively conservative method and to protect the population. Any other question? And Dr. Yin, and you mentioned individual data is very useful. And what is the advantage of the individual data? So how can I understand your view of a point? For example, on Winback's software, if we are based on the individual data, and if we are based on the mainstream data, and then it would be the median SD values, which lead to a loss of certain information. But I also mentioned individual data. From another point of view, IFSA was based on the quartile, and so they cannot get the individual data. So you mean the individual data in the cohort study, right? Yes. Any other question? Professor Liu. Okay. No other question. Okay, then that's all for our morning session. And the combined exposure of multiple contaminants and risk assessment has attracted wide attention because of the exposure and assessment is quite close to the real world that we are all facing. And currently there are different methodologies and strategies developed. And we have heard different methodologies based on population, and this is the fourth year for Section A. And from the very beginning, there were introductions of methodology, framework methodologies, but currently we can see more and more cases. And I believe in the future, and we are going to have more and more cases and research findings to show to you. And many thanks to our keynote speakers again, as well as to our audience. And if next year we still have this Section A, and hopefully, and the pandemic will be gone, and we can have face-to-face communications and exchanges. Thank you again for joining us today. That's all. And it's time for lunch. Thank you. Okay, that's all for this session. Okay, see you next year. 好，也谢谢我们的技术人员。